This is a conversation with Jonathan Schaffer. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Rutgers University, popularly known for his work in epistemology, metaphysics, grounding, and monism. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of asking these philosophical questions. We talk about Quine's work in ontology and what really exists. And then we talk about grounding principles, what's really fundamental, and monism. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort. So if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon or Instagram or Anchor. You can buy a gift on Instagram. You can join as a member on YouTube. You can buy super thanks. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally.
And now it's no time.
In the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a group of pan-dimensional hyper-intelligent beings create this supercomputer called Deep Thought to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And Deep Thought calculates for 7.5 million years and comes up with the answer 42. Upon being asked about this answer, Deep Thought says, I have checked it very thoroughly, and that quite definitely is the answer. I think the problem, to be quite honest with you, is that you've never actually known what the question was. I view philosophy personally as the quest to find the right questions, whether it's about meaning, property, existence, you name it. For someone whose original plan in life was to be a lawyer, at what point did he decide that you want to now switch tracks into philosophy? Even though the world of law is so seductive, at what point did you decide that you want to now dedicate your lives towards the quest for the right questions?
Yeah. Well, Charlotte, that's a great question. And I guess I had a great life plan of being a lawyer and fly. I was going to fly to Geneva and Paris every weekend to negotiate. I don't know exactly what, but it was going to be a glorious life. And then I got to college and I needed one last course to fill out my 4 courses per semester requirement. And it had to be an afternoon course, so I could, sleep in. And so I took a philosophy course thinking, maybe it'll be good training for the law or whatever. And this was at Kenyon College. And my Professor Cyrus Banning, who passed not too long ago, was this sort of he seemed to us like this grumpy old man who delighted in nothing more than refuting his students as quickly and decisively as possible. And all the other kids in the class hated him. But I was baffled and perplexed and fascinated by how he was able to, no one had ever been able to do that to me before. So that was the beginning of my fascination with philosophy. And then I took some more philosophy courses in my sophomore year, not really knowing no particular plan. And I found myself over winter break of my sophomore year of college, bringing my philosophy books back home during the winter vacation and reading my school books during vacation. I'd never done anything like that before. That's when I noticed that something was happening to me.
You are a professor yourself. You just spoke about the professor had such a massive influence in your life. How does it work? Do you think it's the subject that interested you first? Or it was the personality and the professor that got you hooked in, and then the love for the subject came in? As a professor yourself, is this something that you think about when you teach these courses as well?
It was all of the above. I mean, he had a certain sort of perplexing charisma to me. No one else experienced him as charismatic, but I did. I think I definitely responded to him as a person, but also the depth of the questions that he was asking, which touches upon the importance of philosophy. That moved me as well. Like I had never had the opportunity to think about, knowledge and reality in such basic, general, and fundamental terms. And that seemed so powerful to me.
You spoke about the depth of the questions. Can you comment on the importance of these questions itself and the importance of philosophy? There are so many critics of philosophy even today. They say that philosophy is abstract, it's disconnected from reality, maybe it's not practical. Even in history, there have been so many critics of philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein was one. Rudolf Carnap used to say, at least a specific section of philosophy, metaphysical existence claims are meaningless. In recent times, Noam Chomsky, Daniel Dennett, they've all been vocal critics of philosophy. So if you had to write a love letter to all these critics, what would you tell them? Why are these questions important?
I would, first of all, I would tell them they're right. The questions are incredibly abstract. They have little direct practical utility. And moreover, it's very doubtful that we have the intellectual means to settle any of them.
Right.
The history of philosophy hardly, promises much in terms of being able to settle any of the main questions of philosophy. I find the questions so deeply fascinating. Maybe that's just part of how I'm wired. But I also find that the questions are so deeply connected to the practical questions that are, I don't want to say downstream from them, but connected to them. We're all concerned, for instance, with very practical questions of what we should do on a daily basis. What's the right action to do in this case? And to me, it seems like that can't be disconnected from having an underlying theory of what makes things right or wrong. And that's just the case with ethics. But likewise, with metaphysics, which is my home subject, we're all so, I think, deeply concerned about what's out there in reality and the structure of the world, and people on various religious journeys, but also in scientific journeys through physics. Many of us feel in different ways that we can come to glimpse some aspects of what reality is like. And for those of us who care about what reality is like, I don't see how we can avoid at least trying to look at the deepest questions of what it's like, even if the critics are right that we might make little headway into it. So I myself am grateful to have had the opportunity to pursue the questions. I'm happy with that, and I hope that I've had the chance to inspire some other students to be fascinated with the questions. And I think where I might disagree with the critics is that I think there is an intrinsic value to just staring at the questions with fascination and all their mysteriousness.
In that spirit, I agree. There is an intrinsic value. And let's stare at these questions for the next hour and hopefully be fascinated with it in equal measure.
Cheers.
Let's start by setting the foundation for all the questions that will follow. And I want to start with the most foundational paper that probably sparked all of this. So in a paper titled On What There Is, Willard Van Orman Quine said the following words: "A curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? It can be answered, moreover in a word, everything. And everyone will accept this answer as true. However, this is merely to say that there is what there is. There remains room for disagreement over cases, so the issue has stayed alive for centuries." So to set the foundation...
Such a great stylist. I have to comment. Like, he's such a beautiful writer.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's set the foundation with Quine's words and his work. When we make these statements around unicorns don't exist, dragons don't exist, Pegasus is an example he used, doesn't exist, or when we say things like dogs are white, how would you break it apart with the work of Quine and try to extract what exists and what doesn't exist?
Yeah, great. So what Quine promised us was a methodology for extracting what exists and what doesn't exist. And that was groundbreaking. And that's why Quine is widely thought to have rehabilitated metaphysics. Because up until that point, people like Carnap had claimed that metaphysics was meaningless and that there was no sound methodology for pursuing it. It was basically, they viewed it as a kind of swapping of empty hunches and poetry, some poetic flourishes, but sort of devoid of scientific or empirical content, not serious intellectual pursuit. And Quine convinced most, but not all, philosophers who followed that there was a serious intellectual pursuit that was empirically constrained. And here's the idea. We take our best theory of the world, which for Quine was mathematical physics, and we then regiment it in an abstract language. For Quine, that would be first-order logic. And then we think about what kind of domain of entities we need to posit for the theory so regimented to come out true. And Quine says, these are the entities that we are committed to should we endorse the theory that has those commitments. And part of what convinced people that this method had teeth is that Quine himself reported having gone from the view that numbers don't exist to the view that, well, mathematical physics he thought that was our best going theory. And he thought that mathematical physics uses all sorts of mathematical devices, including numbers, and that we needed to posit mathematical entities in order to have the best understanding of how mathematical physics could be true. So Quine himself was moved by his own account of on what there is to embrace the existence of numbers. And so, this method can change your mind, and that feels like it has real teeth.
Let's talk about numbers. You brought it up. There have been so many different schools of thought about numbers. Plato used to believe that numbers are independent, that they reside in this Platonic realm, the Platonic heaven. Aristotle used to believe they are grounded in something concrete, like some real structures out there. And then Immanuel Kant, I'm putting forward a third one, used to believe that numbers are just grounded in your mind, like there's a form of conceptualism. So if we were to approach this from Quine's framework, and I also want to get your thoughts on this, do numbers exist? Is the number one nothing but a name that we've given, or just a language you've developed to understand the world? Or is number an independent entity that actually exists out there?
So Quine first.
Yeah.
Quine thinks that numbers do exist. And his argument for the existence of numbers is that our best theory, mathematical physics, requires numbers to be given in order to get a decent interpretation of the theory.
This is the indispensability argument?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
That's the indispensability argument for numbers. And that's been contested within Quine's framework by people like Hartree Field, who've tried in a book tellingly entitled Science Without Numbers. Field tries to show how you can do at least certain parts of physics without invoking numbers. But that's sort of ongoing controversy about what the indispensability argument really shows with numbers. But that's Quine's answer. You also asked about what my view is, and I agree with Quine. Numbers exist, but not. While I don't disagree with his reasons, I think there's much simpler and far more compelling reasons for saying that numbers exist. And here's a few trivial arguments for the existence of numbers. Are there numbers between 4 and 7? Obviously, yes, there are numbers between 4 and 7, but it follows by standard logical inference that if there are numbers between 4 and 7, then there are numbers, in particular the ones between 4 and 7. Or, are there prime numbers? Well, yes. So there are numbers, including the primes. So I think there are trivial inferences, or what are called adjective drop inferences from like prime number to number, where you drop the adjective prime. There are trivial adjective drop inferences from premises that are mathematically so obvious, like there are numbers between 4 and 7, that no philosophical argument against numbers could possibly have greater weight in terms of obviousness and plausibility than the plausibility of these mathematical truisms. So I think, so I agree with Quine's conclusion, but I think he had a much simpler, more direct, and almost irresistible argument from just obvious mathematical truisms. For Quine, the methodology of doing metaphysics, recall, was regimenting your best theory, mathematical physics for him, and seeing what had to be in the domain for the theory to come out true. But on the argument that I'm giving, it didn't really matter what physics comes to say about the world. Every school child who learns about the number system, who learns that 5 and 6 come between 4 and 7, is already in position to know that there are numbers. So the detour, I would say detour, through sort of advanced science isn't even required to pretty conclusively establish the existence of numbers. One last proviso. That's not to say anything about the nature of numbers. That's not to say whether they're entities in Platonic heaven or Aristotelian concretely grounded things or Kantian conceptual projections, roughly speaking. It's to say they exist, but to leave open what their nature is.
You have a hunch where they belong?
I'm officially neutral on the question, but my hunch is Platonistic.
Okay.
For the following reason, all of the attempts that I've seen to try to get underneath numbers and make sense of numbers in pre-numerical terms fail. Because it seems to me that numbers and numerical thought are so deeply baked in to our way of understanding consider an Aristotelian idea that numbers are grounded in the structure of the concrete realm. That would mean that we'd have to make sense of the concrete realm and it having a structure without yet bringing numbers in, such that we could say, oh, here's the structure of the concrete realm, and numbers, in some sense, emerge out of that. But how are we to make sense of the structure of the concrete realm without mathematical concepts in the first place? So that makes me tentatively inclined to thinking that Plato had it right.
So in other words, if an alien civilization were to land on Earth tomorrow, there would be mutual agreement on the fact that there is something out there that represents number one, that the digits of pi are the digits of pi. They may have a different language for it, but there would be mutual agreement that these exist.
I would hope. I mean, presumably if they're capable of flying a spaceship here, they're pretty smart and probably can engage in the game of reasons at least as well as we can. So yeah, I think I would expect they would find these arguments from like prime numbers to numbers equally compelling.
That makes sense. So I took this digression about numbers. Go back to Quine's work. Let's put forward the statement that dragons don't exist, right? He had used Pegasus. I'm going to use dragons. If I say dragons don't exist, there is something in my mind. There's an idea of a dragon that I'm rejecting. So there's that idea that exists, but maybe the real creature doesn't exist, right? How does Quine view it when you make the statement about dragons? What does exist? What doesn't exist?
Yeah, good. So for Quine, there's this, not just for Quine, I mean, there is this puzzle that he calls Plato's beard.
Yeah.
About how we're able to coherently deny the existence of anything. You used dragons, which is a general term. Just to stick with Quine a little bit, let's have a name for a particular dragon, say Draco.
Okay.
Quine uses Pegasus.
Yeah.
So we want to say, Draco doesn't exist. But here we've used a name, Draco. And how does a name have any meaning whatsoever, goes the puzzle, except via its referent. So, how does Shalaj or Jonathan, what does Shalaj mean? Natural thought, it means you.
Yeah.
But if there's no Draco out there, what could the name even mean? It seems like it's just an empty name and would be meaningless.
Yeah.
So we seem to be able to meaningfully use the name Draco in denying that Draco exists. Likewise, Quine's example, we seem to be able to meaningfully use the name Pegasus in denying that Pegasus exists. How's that possible? That's the puzzle of Plato's beard. And Quine himself followed Bertrand Russell's analysis of names, which is nowadays not considered so viable. But there's a lot of different ideas about how to try to make sense of claims of non-existence.
So how do you break this statement apart in a way that you're not denying, or you're meaningfully using the name, but you're also trying to say that this entire thing doesn't exist? So if when I say dragons don't exist, how do you rework that statement to say that there's nothing out there that even represents a dragon and makes it meaningless?
Yeah, good. So I have some unusual views on the topic.
Sure.
So I'll share my views. They're broadly inspired by David Lewis's modal realist views, though I'm not exactly a modal realist. So David Lewis famously had the view that our universe, our world, our cosmos is just one of an infinite sea of other worlds. Every possible world is in some sense real and existent and out there. So there is another, or many, many other worlds in which there are dragons. Not ours seems to be devoid of dragons, but that's just, there are these other possibilities. If there are other possibilities in which there are dragons, and Lewis, by a kind of Quinean indispensability arguments, thought we were required to posit possible worlds, including those inhabited by dragons. And so Lewis thought, well, actually, dragons do exist. Draco does exist. Pegasus does exist. Not hereabouts, just, in another world. I think that we do need to posit a big outer domain of entities when we're doing our semantics.
Yep.
So I think that the meaning of a name is its referent, and I think Draco and Pegasus are meaningful names. So I posit Draco and Pegasus in my domain. But where I disagree with Lewis is I don't conclude from that Draco or Pegasus exist, because exists is inflected for present tense and for indicative mood. So that to say that something exists is to say that it presently and actually exists. So I want to say for Pegasus that Pegasus could have existed. And so Pegasus is there in the domain, and here I part company from both Quine and Lewis. For me, not everything in the domain exists. Some things in the domain merely existed. Some things in the domain merely could have existed. So that's a bit of an unusual view, and we could probably spend a long time unpacking that, but
so much to get through. This is what you call the domain of quantification?
This is the domain of quantification. Yeah. So it's standardly thought following Quine that the domain of and this actually came out in that quote that you read from the beginning on what there is, that what's in the domain of quantification goes with what there is. But is present tense and indicative. So I think the domain of quantification goes with on what there is, was, or could be.
How different is this domain from the desert landscape that Quine had described, where everything exists?
So it's about as so Quine wanted this desert landscape where as few things as we could get away with were posited in the domain. This domain that I'm positing is much more like Lewis's domain. It has every possible entity that you could conceive of, and even those that are beyond human conception. So it's a radically abundant, as opposed to, so it's the opposite of a desert. It's a blooming arbor, a forest.
Okay, so we laid the foundation with Quine's work. In the past, you've said you found Quine's work slightly frustrating, limiting.
I love Quine's work, but I mean, I feel like a lot of my work is sort of my career. A lot of it is a footnote to Quine, where I'm disagreeing with Quine, but I want to emphasize how much I respect and admire Quine.
Of course, no, that goes without saying. But this is just to lead into the path that you started taking with grounding, and I want to actually touch upon the motivation behind that, because in your paper, Ground Functionalism, you say that a metaphysics that merely lists what there is, as per Quine, lacks explanatory value, since a mere list is not an explanatory structure and provides no understanding. Rather, the metaphysician with the ambition to explain how and why the world is as it is should offer theories of what grounds what. So Quine is a genius, we know it, and a lot of respect for him. But I just want to touch upon, what did you find limiting in Quine's work? What is that one question that was missing in the list of things that exist?
Great. What's missing is that it's just a list.
Right.
It doesn't have enough structure. Maybe the best analogy that I could give, or at least imagine that we wanted to make sense of the causal structure of reality. It's because we wanted to explain, causally speaking, why things were happening. Why did the window shatter? And imagine that I just gave you a list of events, just a kind of bucket of events, but I don't tell you what order they occurred in. I don't give you any principles governing the evolution of events. I just give you a laundry list of events. A window shattered. Someone threw a baseball. Someone jumped up and down. There's not enough information there for you to be able to give an explanation of anything. To give a causal explanation of an outcome, we have to know the causal ordering of events. Maybe that's, at least in worlds like ours, roughly the temporal ordering of events. So maybe like you need to know the time sequence of things. And you need to know also, I think, general principles about how situations evolve, the dynamics, the laws of nature. So you need to transform a mere list of events into a causally explanatory structure. We need to have an ordering over the events and principles that show you how certain happenings flow into others. And then we can explain the outcomes from the outputs, from the inputs that flow into them. That's a kind of general picture I have about how explanation works. And my view of metaphysics is that it ought to be an explanatory enterprise. Take the case of numbers. Given, let's say that we're now convinced that numbers exist. We should still ask, why do they exist? Are they fundamental entities that there's no deeper reason why they exist? Or is there a reason why they exist? Is there something more fundamental than numbers from which numbers flow? And that's to ask the grounding question. And that project of seeking explanations for metaphysical outcomes, I think, requires that same idea of ordering metaphysical happenings in terms of what I call priority. Some are more fundamental than others. And having general principles that show how from some more fundamental metaphysical happenings, we get some less fundamental outcomes. So we can link things up into the same kind of explanatory structure we see on the causal side of the ledger.
The big question that's missing from Quine's work is this question: how? Like, what grounds what? Where do things come from? What is a derivative? What's fundamental? You've alluded to this multiple times, but I want to formally define grounding now. And to introduce the topic, I'm going to quote a verse from the poem Among School Children by William Butler Yeats, who had said that, "O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? O body swayed to music, or brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance?" So let's talk about grounding. What is grounding? What are grounding principles? And how do they help us separate the dancer from the dance?
Right. So grounding is this relation of relative fundamentality that holds between the source and the outcome. Maybe it would help if I gave a good representative example, and this will also help with the grounding principles and maybe knowing the dancer from the dance. Yeah. So one of the classic examples, which comes from Kit Fine's work, Kit Fine is one of the sort of first, he's really the sort of first person in the grounding literature. He's the prime mover of the grounding literature. One of Fine's examples comes from set theory. Mm-hmm. So we have the idea, we have this individual, this person, Socrates, and we also have this set, singleton Socrates, the set whose one and only member is the individual Socrates. Mm-hmm. And there's this natural idea, if you think about the way set theory is usually conceived of, where you can think of set theory in terms of this machine, where at any given stage, you have a bunch of entities in your hand. Yeah. You spit those entities in the machine, and that machine takes in all the different pluralities of entities that you've fed into the machine, and it pops out sets that have all and only the elements of that plurality as its members. Yeah. So you pop Socrates into the machine, and singleton Socrates pops out the other side of the machine. That's a sort of nice image of how the set theoretic machinery is working. And that makes it feel compelling, I think, to say that Socrates is the more fundamental of those entities. If you look out in reality and you see, oh, look, there's singleton Socrates. You come to believe in set theory. So you say, singleton Socrates is an entity that is in my ontology that I believe in. And you ask, how and why did singleton Socrates get into the world? Yeah. Here's a great answer to that explanatory question, which is Socrates was in the world. Never mind how Socrates, there's questions about how Socrates got into the world. We'll start there. Okay. Socrates is in the world. And we have this machine, the set formation machine, that takes Socrates in and spits out singleton Socrates. And now I think you have a completely unmysterious, satisfying account. That's why singleton Socrates is there, because you have Socrates and you have a machine that transforms Socrates into singleton Socrates. So grounding is the relationship between the more fundamental entity, in this case Socrates, and the less fundamental outcome, in this case singleton Socrates. Many people would want to do this in terms of facts. So they would want to say the fact that Socrates exists and the fact that singleton Socrates exists. I'm doing it in terms of things. That's a bit of a controversy, just to flag that for those in the know. But there's widespread agreement that there's some crucial asymmetry between Socrates, or the fact that Socrates exists on the one hand, and singleton Socrates, or the fact that singleton Socrates exists on the other. And the asymmetry is that this one's more fundamental, the fact Socrates or the fact that Socrates exists. And singleton Socrates, or the fact that, I'll just stick with the entities, so I won't do the facts anymore. That singleton Socrates is a derivative outcome that you get from having the more fundamental ground, Socrates, together with this grounding principle, set formation, that's telling you how it is that it's kind of giving you a kind of metaphysical dynamics. It's telling you how, if you've got Socrates, that's going to flow into getting singleton Socrates.
And bring this back to Quine. So how you're differentiating this list of things that exist. Now you're creating like this tripartite structure where you have inputs on the left, the outcome or the effects on the right, and you have these causal links or these grounding principles in the middle. So you're showing a hierarchy of what's actually fundamental. How does that, or how does what's derivative out of it emerge from what's fundamental?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's meant to be the same kind of structure that you might think of the physicist as seeking. You might think of, here's a natural view, I think, of the physicist's task. Her task is to posit a set of initial conditions and a dynamics that can causally explain the entire rest of history. So I'm thinking of the metaphysician as having the analogous explanatory task. Posit a set of, now not initial conditions, but fundamental conditions. Yeah. And now not a set of sort of temporal dynamics, but a kind of grounding dynamics of how the less fundamental entities spill out from the more fundamental entities, such that we can explain all of derivative reality from the fundamental basis.
You had parked aside the question of where does Socrates come from? So what about the nature of these structures? So we have on the left the grounds, we have the grounding principle, and then we have the derivatives. What's the nature of all of these? Obviously, one's fundamental, one's derivative. Are these emergent from something concrete, something material? Where do these come from?
So, well, Socrates, I think, would be a poor candidate to be a fundamental entity himself.
Right.
But among the more plausible theories of what fundamental entities Socrates flows out of would be, one option would be a kind of atomistic theory that says, well, there's a bunch of fundamental particles that compose Socrates. Right. And so we might try to break Socrates down into the tiniest Lego bits that ultimately construct him. An alternative, which I've myself have tried to champion, is a monistic alternative that you alluded to, where it's thought that reality isn't built up piecewise from the tiniest building blocks, but rather reality is a kind of entangled, is most fundamentally an entangled whole. And Socrates is abstracted out. Instead of built up from tiny bits, Socrates is abstracted away from the cosmos as a whole. It's a fragment of a single entangled cosmos. So those are possible answers to where to the fundamental roots of Socrates' reality.
You spoke about the roots of Socrates. Let's talk about the roots of the grounding principles.
Right.
Yeah. So is it possible the grounding principles are fundamental? Are those also grounded in something else? And then the question is, what's that grounded in? This is infinite regress that's being created.
Yes, exactly. So I think I've come to be convinced. When I started, I had broadly what get called in the literature Humean sympathies. This is sort of David Hume via David Lewis.
Yep.
And the idea is mainly seen with respect to the laws of nature, where the Humean view is that the laws of nature are not additional fundamental constituents of the universe, but they're really just summaries of the pattern of events. So that's the Hume-Lewis view. I went into grounding thinking that that's probably how, liking the Humean view with laws of nature, and thinking that was probably how it was going to go with grounding principles, that they were just going to be derivative summaries of the pattern of outcomes. But I came to think that that couldn't work. I came to think, for exactly the kind of infinite regress worries that you alluded to, that we had to posit some grounding principles as just basic, fundamental principles of how the world works. And the argument roughly is this, I mean, you were alluding to it already, it's that if we want to think of grounding principles as derivative, remember on this, at least the picture that I was going in for, to get a derivative outcome like singleton Socrates, you need a more fundamental input like Socrates, and a principle from which that's going to drive Socrates into singleton Socrates. But that means that we can't ever get underneath all the principles. If we ever want to get something on this picture that's going to get us grounding principles, there would be some kind of input and some kind of principle already that's driving the input into the principles. So there's no way to ever derive all of the principles except by positing some principles already from which to extract them on the picture that I like. So for better or worse, I'm committed to something analogous to the Tim Maudlin view about, I know someone who you've interviewed and someone who is actually a teacher and mentor of mine. So the Tim Maudlin view of laws of nature is they are simply additional fundamental constituents of the universe. The fundamental laws of temporal evolution is Maudlin's term for them. So I'm committed on the grounding side to something quite analogous. I'm committed to fundamental, instead of fundamental laws of temporal evolution, fundamental laws of metaphysical evolution, if you like.
It's interesting. So I recently also interviewed Stephen Wolfram. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this work. And he describes, and now we talk about the temporal evolution, he describes rules and cellular automata and how this complexity emerges from these simple rules. Have you come across his work? And I feel like there are a lot of similarities, at least in temporal evolution, of these rules being these causal links between the fundamental atoms and the complexity that emerges out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that shows you how we can, from like a classic example is Conway's Game of Life.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So from just a cluster of very simple rules governing, which cells are populated at a given stage, we see this kind of, looks like this sort of emergent complex behavior, and we can codify kind of higher level rules that are also governing the game of life. But really it's all coming out of this very simple handful of rules in this fascinating way. So I think that's a beautiful example of what I would call sort of, grounded outcomes. So we can get like these, gliders and other like self-sustaining systems in the game of life. But ultimately they're to be understood in terms of just, cells being populated and this fundamental, simple handful of rules. There's a beautiful illustration.
I agree. It's such a powerful idea. And I remember when I first came across the game of life and the cellular automata, like such a powerful idea about how rules can create complexity. And now like this analogous idea of this occurring in metaphysics as well is such a powerful idea. Let's try to take this structure we've created into one of the biggest long-standing problems that we've had in philosophy. In 1996, David Chalmers said the following words: "For a number of years, I had hoped for a materialist theory. When I gave up on this hope, it was quite reluctantly. It eventually seemed plain to me that these conclusions were forced on anyone who wanted to take consciousness seriously. Materialism is a beautiful and compelling view of the world, but to account for consciousness, we have to go beyond the resources it provides." The mind-body problem is one of the most long-standing, famous problems in philosophy. Not just philosophy, even poets have struggled with it. William Butler Yeats, we just quoted earlier, he had an entire poem titled Dialogue Between the Self and the Soul. Walt Whitman had once written, "I'm the poet of the body and the poet of the soul." That is at a conflict between the two. The mind-body problem has plagued both philosophers and poets alike. How does grounding principles, how does that help revisit this question and maybe even point us in the right direction?
Great. Yeah, so I've tried to make the case that this conception of metaphysical grounding opens new resources for a materialist/physicalist conception of reality, which I myself favor, and Chalmers himself in that beautiful passage favored as well until he felt just compelled to abandon it.
Yeah.
So this is new hope for reviving a physicalist materialist perspective. And the idea is that Chalmers was right about consciousness. He's right that just from the physics alone, we will never be able to get the kind of a priori entailment that he sought for consciousness. And what that, for Chalmers, what that means is, roughly speaking, a perfect mind, an ideal mind. Should she be told the exact physical layout of the universe, that wouldn't be enough information for her to figure out if any beings in that universe were having conscious experiences, or if we were all just, as it were, as in Chalmers' term, zombies who were merely behaving but weren't feeling anything on the inside, whether the lights are on the inside or not. So I think Chalmers is right about consciousness. I just think that same argument works for almost any derivative outcome whatsoever. So I think that same ideal mind, told merely of the physical layout of the universe, also wouldn't know whether there are any sets, because she wouldn't know yet whether the principle of set formation, that machine, the analogy with that machine that I was talking about earlier, she wouldn't know whether the set formation machine was operative. So she might know that there's a particular particle, let's say, Sparky the electron. She might say, okay, Sparky the electron exists, but is there such a thing as the set singleton Sparky, the set that has Sparky as its one and only member? I say she's not yet she hasn't been given enough information to answer the question until she's been given the information as to whether or not the principle of set formation is operative. Tell her set formation is operative and that ideal mind, boom, she'll immediately be able to figure out that singleton Sparky exists. But tell her that set formation isn't operative and no analogous set formation principle is operating either, and she'll immediately be able to figure out, there is no set singleton Sparky or any other set for that matter. So you just have to add to the ideal mind. You have to give her the additional information of which grounding principles are operative. So I think that from the fundamental metaphysical happenings, plus the grounding principles, the ideal mind should be able to derive all of derivative reality. For instance, given that Sparky the electron exists in set formation, she'd be able to derive that singleton Sparky exists. Given a certain physical layout and certain principles of chemical and biological grounding, she'll be able to figure out the chemical and the biological structure of the world. And I want to say just this is true of consciousness as well. Give the ideal mind the mere physical layout. Don't tell her the grounding principles through which the physical structure flows out into consciousness, and she's just not been given enough information. Chalmers is right. But the solution in all cases is to recognize that the ideal mind needs not just the fundamental inputs, but also the grounding principles. And then she's in position to know what sets exist, what organisms exist, and equally, if she has principles that tell her this sort of physical system flows into, physical system like mine, flows into a consciousness that's experiencing, I'm pinching myself right now, a little pinchy bit of pain, then she'll be able to derive immediately that I'm experiencing a little pain. So I think the insight that Chalmers was pointing towards isn't that there's something special about the mind, but that in general, we always need these grounding principles. Imagine a physicist who just posited initial conditions and thought, I should be able to recover the rest of history just positing the initial conditions without positing any dynamical laws. That would be a hopeless task. Given just the initial conditions and no dynamics, you have no idea what's to follow. You need the initial conditions plus the dynamics. And so I'm trying to make the same point on the side of metaphysical structure. And the new hope that I was trying to muster up for the physicalist materialist view is that it might just be only physical stuff that's fundamental. That's what I think. It's only physical stuff that's fundamental. But that there are grounding principles that will tell us that from this physical stuff being in this such and such a condition, we get this sort of conscious experience. And now we have an entirely demystifying physicalist explanation for conscious experience, which is the holy grail for a physicalist view.
Does it matter that we, in the mind-body problem, we are part of the structure in the sense, and let's say if you're looking at water, and if you're identifying the fundamental units for now, just assume hydrogen and oxygen are the fundamental units, and then there's the causal link, the grounding principle that creates the water molecule, right? So we have that input and the output. But in the case of the mind-body problem, we are the output and we are the other end, where we are the derivatives. Do you think that makes a difference, that you said it's a lack of information, that I don't know what the grounding principle is, which is why it looks like consciousness just emerges out, like it's a separate thing. It's not from material objects. Yeah. But the fact that I am the output, is it even possible to detach myself from this structure and take an external view? Or because I'm always entwined within this tripartite structure, I'll always be biased and probably not possible to know the grounding principle?
That is a view. On the view that I was going for, the fact that we ourselves are part of the structure isn't playing any special role in the issue. Okay. I mean, in a certain sense, we ourselves are biological organisms, but almost no one thinks that prevents us from giving an account of biological structure in terms of physical structure. So I'd want to say, you might say for various reasons that consciousness is special, but I think just as we can make sense of biological structure as coming out of physical structure, even though we are biological organisms, so we can make sense of conscious experience as coming out of physical structure, even though we ourselves, of course, are conscious experiencers.
And then taking this back to just grounding in general, so every part of the structure, the sources, the grounding principles, and the outputs, all of them emergent from physical structures.
So the physical structures, by my lights, would be the fundamental sources. The grounding they're just something else. Remember, I'm committed to this Tim Maudlin-like view. So I think that there are, that among the metaphysically fundamental, there are two boxes for the metaphysically fundamental. It's a bit like for the physicist, there are the initial conditions and there are the laws of nature. And they're just separate and independent posits. And they're sort of equally basic in a certain sense. Likewise, on my view, there are the fundamental conditions that are purely physical, but there are also these principles of metaphysical derivation that aren't physical in any specific way. They might link the physical to the chemical. So they might have like 1 foot in the physical side and 1 foot in the chemical side. Or they might just link entities of any sort, physical or not, to set theoretic entities in the case, the set formation case. So the set formation case, the principle of set formation just doesn't know or care whether the entities it takes in are physical or who knows what. Feed it, the principle of set formation just says, feed it any entities whatsoever, and it spits out sets.
I want to close the loop on this question we had opened earlier about the existence of numbers. So where do numbers fall in this structure? Are they fundamental or are they derivative?
You're good. So on the Platonistic view, they are fundamental. So this is, some people would say that shows that, some people take this to be contrary to a physicalist view. Mm-hmm. So this is going with a kind of conception of physicalism that's sort of very tied into kind of materialism, like the physicalist posits like concrete material objects, and numbers seem like paradigmatically abstract immaterial objects.
Yep.
So some people will feel that positing fundamental abstracta, such as numbers, is already a rejection of physicalism and going for some kind of like two-realm theory that has both a a physical receptacle and a platonic heaven above it, or something like that. My view is that the notion of physical needs to be stretched. We see in our best physics a need for, this is Quine, a need for mathematical entities. And so we should think of the mathematical entities as physical, but not maybe material. So there's a certain delicate dance that I have to perform at some point. And one option is to try to make this a more kind of Aristotelian or Kantian view of numbers work. For some physicalists, that'll be the preferred option. Another option is to stretch the notion of the physical, to try to say that some abstract entities like numbers are physical. That's what I was going for better or worse. And a third option is to say, okay, this isn't quite physicalism, but it's not dualism either, because it's not saying that minds are fundamental. It's saying that there's fundamental concrete entities, which are maybe little particles or the whole cosmos, never mind where that goes, but nothing mental. And there's some fundamental abstract entities in the mix as well, and platonic heaven or what have you. So this is a kind of monism in the philosophy of mind, because there's no fundamental mental entities like the dualist would posit. But whether it's physicalist or not is a tricky issue.
You brought up monism twice. I think we have to define it. What is monism? What is the monist view?
So the monist view, it would help to start with if I introduce a distinction. So existence monism is the view that exactly one entity exists. This is the view that was for decades, if not centuries, foisted on the classical monist philosophers like Spinoza and Hegel. And it was the only it was thought that to the extent that there is an intelligible doctrine of monism at all, it must be this existence monism doctrine that exactly one entity exists. Yeah. And wow, is that a hard doctrine to swallow? Because that's saying that if to the extent that you exist and I exist, we must be identical. But clearly we're not. So, or even to go back to my number case, I was saying there's numbers between 4 and 7. But if there's only one entity that exists, if it's even a number, then there's only one number, which is, of course, there's not just one number. In fact, from the number case, we get a trivial argument for there being some order of some infinitude of entities, not just one. So that's existence monism, and that's widely regarded as an absurd doctrine, and I agree. What my work on monism was about was bringing out another meaning for monism, which has to do with grounding, where the idea is that there's a single fundamental entity, or at least within the concrete cosmos. Let's leave the abstract entities to the side. Within concrete reality, there's a single fundamental entity, the cosmos as a whole. That's not to deny that you exist, nor is it to deny that I exist, nor is it to deny that we're not identical. Of course, we're not identical. It's rather to say that your existence and my existence are derivative existence. We're each separate derivative fragments of the same one whole. So I call that priority monism. That's the monism that I mean to be invoking.
So what are the implications? And this is channeling one of the questions that we started with. If you take the monist view of there being this integrated whole, the cosmos as a whole being fundamental, and we just happen to be derivatives of this fundamental whole, versus the pluralist view that we are actually fundamental, or even on a smaller level, that these fundamental units that come together and make up the cosmos, and the cosmos is just a derivative of these fundamental units. Either viewpoint, if I take the monist view or the pluralist view, and this is going back to the first question about the importance of asking these questions, what are some of the profound implications of taking this monist viewpoint? How does that change the way I view the world or the work I do?
Yeah, great question. I don't know that it does change the way you view the world. It may change the way you view the world. I don't know if it changes the work that you do in any direct way.
Right.
This is one of these sort of background, subtle, big picture views that can maybe have profound implications in conjunction with a family of other views. But among the things that I think are at issue between the monist and the pluralist views of reality include things like how we understand physics. So if we want to think, as I do, of physics as giving us our best insight into the nature of concrete reality, we might ask, is physics giving us a picture of lots of tiny independent particles? And there are certain views of physical structure that do seem to comport well with that picture.
Yep.
Or is it giving us a picture of a single entangled cosmos? And I think there are certain ways of thinking about quantum mechanical structure in which the best way to think about reality is that what's fundamental is the wave function of the cosmos as a whole, and the physical reality of subsystems within the entangled universe is to be understood as derivative from the wave function of the cosmos as a whole. So this is the monism pluralism metaphysical question is, I think, interconnected with questions of what our best physics looks like. I think it's interconnected with a number of other sort of maybe more abstract questions about the structure of part-whole relations. Yeah. For instance, at least, so there's this classical logic of the part-whole relation called classical mereology, associated with people like Nelson Goodman. And according to classical mereology, it's a theorem of classical mereology that there is for any collection of entities in your domain, you're going to get a topmost element that is as it were, the largest whole with a W. That's the fusion of all the entities of the domain. The thing that brings them all together.
The superset.
The whole shebang.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not built into classical mereology, quite intentionally, that there have to be smallest elements. So classical mereology is intentionally constructed to be consistent with the, I think, serious empirical hypothesis that things just get ever smaller without limit. That as we sort of imagined we could sort of cut things in half, that we could just keep going limitlessly and we would never get to a smallest point. But for anything or things that we found, they would always be further divisible. It's called atomless gunk, is the label that's sometimes given for that kind of scenario. So if you're a monist, a priority monist, not an existence monist, thinks there's only one thing, but a priority monist who thinks the largest whole is fundamental, one thing that you can take comfort in, given classical mereology, is that the thing that you think is fundamental, you're guaranteed to find. But if you're a certain kind of priority pluralist who thinks that, at least this kind of thinker, who thinks that the smaller the thing is, the more fundamental it is, who thinks that like the smaller building blocks build up the larger things, you're not guaranteed to find any smallest entities in classical mereology. So you're not guaranteed to find any fundamental entities on this conception of things. So if the metaphysician was trying to find the fundamental entities that out of which reality was built, there's a worry looming for the pluralist that her search might be in vain. There might be no fundamental entities on her conception to be found. Whereas the monist, given classical mereology, is guaranteed to have an entity to point to the whole shebang and call it fundamental. So those are some of the more abstract, less sort of more logical and less physicsy issues that come into play in the monism pluralism debate.
You started off by saying that it might not have any practical profound implication, but I think this is a really powerful idea. And if I were to relate it into theoretical physics, for example, where they're trying to find the fundamental theory, effectively what you're saying is that if you take a top-down approach where you start with the big thing and try to keep drilling down, you might land at the most fundamental particles. But if you're going to start with this bottom-up approach where you set the benchmark of what is fundamental and try to build up, you will never actually find what's below it and what's fundamental.
You might never. It might. I think it's just simply an open empirical question whether our world bottoms out in smallest bits, or whether it happens to be limitlessly decomposable into smaller and smaller bits without end.
And your hunch is that it is decomposable.
Oh, I don't know. I don't even have a hunch. I'm really agnostic on that question. I think it's just a completely open empirical question.
So many open questions, so much to think about.
Yes.
We are approaching the end of the hour, so I do have to start wrapping up. But before we move into some of our closing questions, I would love it if you can interpret what masterpieces I've built with the Lego. What do you think this is?
Well, this, of course, looks like a medieval tower.
That's exactly what I was going for.
I've been playing too many video games with my son, so that's what I'm thinking here. And this, I thought window, and then somehow out of here, I thought submarine. I don't know why I thought submarine, but I thought submarine.
Yeah.
So that's
a hybrid between a submarine and a window and a medieval tower on the output, some grounding principle, and then a simple brain, mine, at the left-hand side. And that explains it all. So even Lego can be explained by these grounding principles. Beautiful. Amazing. Let's move into some of our closing questions. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
All right. What a great question. So books. So when I think books, movies, and role models, for books, I think I'll mention a couple of philosophy books and a non-philosophy.
Okay, amazing. Yeah.
2 philosophy books that have really had profound influence on me. One I found, actually, this was one of the ones I was reading in my sophomore year in college when I came home and fell in love with philosophy. Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. Such a clear, beautiful, compelling account of some of the deepest problems. Another one that I encountered my second year in graduate school, actually in Professor Tim Maudlin's metaphysics class.
Right.
David Lewis's On the Plurality of Worlds, where he espouses that modal realist doctrine that I alluded to earlier, on which there are all these other possible worlds. I read that book cover to cover in one sitting. It reveals a lot about my crazy mind, but I felt that was a page turner for me. That was gripping. And that to me has been just a role model for how to do philosophy. Lewis is so clear and thoughtful and engaged and brilliant. And so I've always wanted to, aspired to that kind of standard for my work. So to give a nonfiction example as well. And the thing that leapt to mind, which sort of shows what a cool, not at all geeky person I am, was, of course, Lord of the Rings. And actually a character that's always I found compelling in Lord of the Rings is a kind of a minor character, Samwise Gamgee.
Wow.
Of course. You remember Samwise. So Samwise is Frodo's loyal companion on his perilous trip to the lands of Mordor. And Sam is loyal, and he shoulders the load day after day. And as a parent, as someone, I admire Sam, and I think of that as a kind of a model for how I lead my daily life. So that's books.
You're going to give 2 nonfiction recommendations, I thought.
I'll mention another one. There's a pretty cool character, but a book that I love is David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. I've reread that book 3 times, and I finally think I sort of get the plot, maybe, but I don't know. It's such a wildly imaginative, crazy book that I love it.
Okay. Movies.
I'll mention one. This is the movie of my childhood. My sister and I rented out Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail at least 20 times. And we would entertain ourselves on like family car trips by just, my parents must have been like so horrified, but it's like quoting endless lines of dialogue from Quest for the Holy Grail. And that movie has really sort of shaped like my sense of humor and how I interact with people, a certain like love of absurdity. I don't know, that movie has really shaped me. Role models.
Role models.
I'm going to mention two,
Okay.
a philosopher and a non-philosopher.
Okay, let's go.
My philosopher role model is David Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
I encountered David Lewis when I was a student. I sat in on one of his seminars on causation. And I gave a presentation in the seminar that was sort of full of like these half-baked ideas. And Lewis took one of the ideas that I had sort of crudely and vaguely gestured towards, completely and instantaneously cleaned it up and said, this is your example. Okay, sure, that's my example. That became my first publication, trumping preemption, and kind of made the start of my career. And Lewis was demonstrated in this story such intellectual generosity. So many other people would have just, run with the idea if they liked it at all, maybe given a footnote. To, he just fixed my idea up, transformed it really, and just handed it back to me with this is your idea. And so I've always tried to live up to that when encountering students and or colleagues or just in intellectual exchanges generally. And he really saved my career. Like he made me feel like, I can do this. I can have worthwhile ideas. So I credit him with, keeping me in the game. The other person I'll mention as a role model is my mother. My mother, bless her, decided that she was never going to tell her children, I told you so.
Yeah.
Because that's what her parents had done to her and she hated it. Mm-hmm. She was always going to give them reasons. Mm-hmm. And little did she know that she had turned my sister and I into little debating machines who very quickly learned to debate back. And so that idea of having not just being able to say, I told you so, or taking the mantle of authority, but having to give reasons for all you believe, that's really shaped who I am. And I think that's what allowed me to take an interest in philosophy at all, because philosophy to me is so deeply intertwined with this practice of trying to find the reasons for what we hold true.
I'm always so fascinated by these grounds of what got people to where they are. Mm. And maybe just the grounding principle of your mother saying, I'm never going to tell them I told you so. And that created the inclination to debate back, and that led you towards law and then philosophy. And then even that course that you took in college and that one professor and how that led you down this path. It's so fascinating, the grounds and how you end up creating this beautiful legacy.
To add one other interconnection, what compelled me about Professor Banning, that philosophy professor, was I thought I was so good at debate. I was a high school debater. We were the national champs. I thought I can handle myself. He destroyed me, and without even trying, and that blew my mind.
Last three questions. Over the course of this conversation, we've brought up some heavyweights in philosophy. You spoke about Lewis, spoke about Bertrand Russell, Quine, Carnap, Putnam, David Hume, Aristotle, Plato, Kant. We've created this pantheon of heavyweights in philosophy. In physics in particular, people talk about these big names that actually moved it were disruptors, and names like Newton and Einstein come through. If you had to pick a name in philosophy of this one person that had the most powerful ideas that in a way disrupted the way not just you think, but the entire community, academics in general, who would be that one philosopher whose ideas you find the most powerful?
Most disruptive?
Or like the most powerful
The
ideas?
most powerful,
Yeah.
yeah. So I might have to split the baby on this one.
Okay.
So part of me wants to say Aristotle, because I think if you look at the gap between, by my lights, between sort of where Plato is, at least in the dialogues, and where Aristotle is, the intellectual leap that Aristotle is taking, I think, is just unprecedented. I don't myself know of any other stage in the history of philosophical development where you like take such a huge advance in thinking. So I'm going Aristotle there.
Okay.
Although not disruptive, but I would say influential, at least on my thinking, is going to be David Lewis. Yeah. I was really sort of raised Lewisian, and I've strayed off the path. Certainly with grounding, David Lewis would not have been so happy with grounding. But where I've strayed off the path, it was because I was on the path and some reasons led me off the path. So it was starting from Lewis's way of thinking about so many things that led me to wherever I've gotten to.
Two heavyweights for sure. You spoke about the historical, or like how your mother swore that she would never tell you I told you so, and how that led you towards this path. So in that spirit, I have to ask you, what would you like your legacy to be now that you're in this world of philosophy?
I sometimes imagine, when I'm gone, like my son looking back at my work and being like, what on earth is that?
Yeah.
So I feel mildly embarrassed when I have those thoughts. I think I would like to be a role model in the way that David Lewis was a role model for me.
Yeah.
I'd like to inspire people to pose the deepest questions and be fascinated by them. And I'd like to think that maybe some questions that had been lost or overlooked, like questions about grounding and questions about monism versus pluralism, I'd like to think of my legacy as maybe helping bring those questions back onto the table. But I would just be happy to be an example of someone who passionately explored these questions, and maybe others will find that a fascinating thing to do as well.
You've definitely built that legacy already. I'm tempted to squeeze in one more question because you brought it up. I want to talk about death. So Albus Dumbledore had said that to a well-organized mind, death is the next great adventure. You're someone who has clearly thought about a lot of things and the existence of a lot of things. And I'm going to ask you a question about, I guess, not the existence of something. What do you think of mortality? Is that something that drives you and the work you do, the work and the legacy you're trying to build? And what happens when we die?
Wow. So I'm a physicalist. Yeah. So I think that what happens when we die is our bodies go into the ground and we decompose.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the whole story. It might be a sad story for those who'd hoped for a spiritual immortality, but that's, I think, our best conception of what the world offers us. And it does make me feel like my time on this earth is precious. The moments that I have with friends, family, loved ones, it's precious time because our time is finite. So I find that tragic but inspiring at the same time.
Final question. We've been discussing what exists, what's fundamental, what's grounded in what. So I'm going to go back to the first question we started with. This is the question that Deep Thought didn't answer satisfactorily, at least for me. You're someone who's worked with David Rose as well on the purpose and these questions. So I'm going to ask you the question about this elusive thing, whether it exists or not, and that's about purpose and meaning. So what is the meaning of life, Jonathan Schaffer? Does it exist? Is there one? And what is it grounded in?
So it's a funny thing, the meaning of life. It's the kind of question that so many of us get excited about philosophy because we want to know. And then as we go on in philosophy, we find that at least within the analytic tradition, almost no one talks about it. And it's kind of poo-pooed or put aside, like, what did that even mean? Who knows?
Yeah.
So I guess what I think is we can distinguish between the idea of the objective meaning of something versus its subjective meaning, its meaning for a person. I don't know that there's such a thing as the objective meaning of life. I don't know that there are objective meanings at all. Maybe there are. But there certainly are subjective meanings for me in my life. In fact, we know, just as a matter of kind of empirical psychology, about the kind of things that tend to be subjectively meaningful for people. And they tend to be interpersonal connection, family, giving, love, gratitude, kindness. So this isn't going to be an answer about the objective meaning of life, because I don't know that there is one. But I do recognize a subjective meaning of life, and that's connection and gratitude and kindness. So that's the meaning of life that I know of.
All great meanings: gratitude, kindness, love, always the answer. Professor, if people want to connect with you, find out more about your work, read up more, where can they go? How can they find you?
Well, I have a website, www.jonathanschaffer.org, or .net. I think it's .org. I don't even remember.
Try both.
Try both.
And you'll eventually land there.
That's got a collection of my published papers. They're mainly for fellow academics. They're not, they might not be the most accessible papers, but they might be. Try.
I think they are. And it's definitely really interesting stuff and open up this new world for me as well. So I highly, highly recommend it. Professor, it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Shalaj, is a pleasure.